What happens when a racist airline manager tries to block a black pilot from boarding, only to find out the shocking truth? This is the story of how one man's prejudice is exposed in the most unexpected way, and the lesson that follows. Stay tuned to find out how it all unfolds. There was a man named Richard Stevens. He worked as a manager for one of the largest airlines in the country. Richard was known for two things: his strict, no-nonsense attitude and his biased ways. He had always treated his employees, especially those of different races, in a way that left many feeling uncomfortable and mistreated. His reputation preceded him. The moment anyone heard his name, they knew he was difficult to deal with. And more than a few people whispered about his discriminatory behavior. He never outright admitted to being biased, but his actions told a different story. On this particular day, Richard was preparing for a routine flight. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, and it appeared like it was going to be another smooth day at the airport. Little did he know, things were about to change in a way he never expected. As Richard walked through the terminal, checking the flight schedules, his eyes locked on the upcoming flight crew. Among them was someone he didn't recognize: a black pilot. Richard immediately felt a shift in his chest, a feeling he couldn't quite shake off. His mind raced as he wondered what to do. The thought of letting this pilot board the plane made him uneasy. In his mind, he couldn't help but feel that something wasn't right, even though he had no reason to feel this way. He quickly made up his mind. He would make sure this pilot wouldn't be taking the flight today. But little did Richard know, his decision was going to lead him down a path that would force him to face something far more uncomfortable than he could have ever imagined. The pilot, whose name was Marcus Johnson, walked into the airport terminal with a calm confidence. He was dressed in his sharp uniform, the gold stripes on his sleeves shining in the light. His posture was perfect, and every step he took radiated professionalism. He had worked hard to get to this point, earning every certification and hour of flight time. Marcus was no stranger to the struggles that came with being a black man in a predominantly white industry. He had faced prejudice before, but he had never let it shake his determination. He knew his abilities and knew he was more than qualified for the job. Today, he was ready for another flight, ready to show what he could do. As he made his way toward the gate, Richard noticed him from across the room. The sight of Marcus stopped him in his tracks. There was something about him that made Richard feel unsettled. He quickly dismissed the thought, telling himself it was just nerves. But deep down, Richard couldn't ignore the uneasy feeling. Marcus walked up to the desk, smiled at the clerk, and showed his credentials. "I'm Captain Marcus Johnson, scheduled for Flight 562 today," he said, calmly, his voice steady. Richard watched the interaction from a distance. His eyes narrowed, and a sense of doubt started to creep into his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He had seen other pilots before, but there was something about Marcus that bothered him. Without knowing why, Richard's mind made an immediate judgment. He didn't know Marcus, didn't know anything about him, but something inside him told him to take action. Richard watched Marcus as he continued through the terminal. There was something about him that just didn't sit right. It wasn't about his appearance or his qualifications, but something about the way he carried himself made Richard uneasy. Richard's mind was already made up before he even approached the desk. He walked over to the gate, trying to shake off the discomfort he felt. "Captain Johnson," Richard called, his tone sharp. Marcus turned around, offering a polite smile. "Yes, sir?" "There seems to be a mix-up with your flight details," Richard said, his voice deliberately cold. "I'm afraid you're not cleared to board today." Marcus blinked, surprised by the sudden interruption. "What do you mean, sir? My flight is scheduled. I've confirmed everything." Richard shook his head. "I'm sorry, but I have no choice. You'll have to step aside. There's an issue with your paperwork." Marcus looked at him, trying to understand what was going on. "I've completed all the necessary checks. My paperwork is in order. I've done this flight hundreds of times." Richard didn't flinch. "I'm not sure what to tell you. I can't let you on this plane." Marcus paused, trying to maintain his calm. He could feel something was wrong, something beyond a simple mistake with paperwork. He had been in this situation before, but it had always been different. This time, it felt like the manager wasn't just making a mistake. He was deliberately refusing to let him fly. "I understand you may be confused, sir," Marcus said with respect. "But I assure you, everything is in order. Please, let's check this together." Richard didn't seem to care about the facts. He was stubborn. His mind was made up. "No, I said no. You're not flying today." Marcus's heart began to race, but he refused to show it. He stood his ground, ready to challenge Richard's decision. He knew he wasn't going to back down. But he also knew this wasn't going to be an easy fight. Marcus could feel the weight of the situation settling on him. He had faced discrimination before, but this was different. There was no hiding from it. Richard was standing firm, refusing to let him board the plane, no matter how much Marcus explained. But Marcus wasn't the type to back down easily. "I need you to call someone higher up," Marcus said, his voice steady. He wasn't asking, he was demanding. Richard paused, taken aback by Marcus's boldness. "You think you can just talk your way through this?" "I'm in charge here," he said, his words dripping with authority. "I'm not asking for special treatment," Marcus replied calmly. "I'm asking for fairness. And if you can't provide that, then I'm going to need to speak with someone who can." For a moment, Richard hesitated. The idea of someone questioning his authority didn't sit well with him. But the thought of having this conversation escalate even further made him uncomfortable. He had made his decision, and he didn't want to be seen as weak. But Marcus stood there, unflinching. His eyes were calm, but there was a quiet determination behind them. He knew that if he didn't speak up now, nothing would change. "I'll call someone," Richard grumbled, walking toward the back office. He didn't look back at Marcus, but the tension between them hung in the air, thick and heavy. Marcus stayed where he was, his gaze shifting toward the other employees who had started to gather near the desk. Some of them seemed uneasy, looking at the exchange with a mixture of discomfort and curiosity. Others stood silently, too afraid to speak out. Marcus knew the situation was getting bigger than just him and Richard. This was a stand against something much deeper than a simple mistake or misunderstanding. He wasn't just fighting for his right to fly. He was fighting against the bias that had been allowed to thrive within the system for far too long. As Richard disappeared into the office, Marcus remained calm. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but he wasn't about to let this moment slip by without standing up for what was right. After what felt like an eternity, Richard returned from the back office, his face tight with frustration. Behind him, a senior manager walked into the scene, a tall, well-dressed man with an air of authority about him. His presence immediately changed the mood in the room. The crowd of employees watching the scene unfold went silent. The senior manager, a man named David Hall, looked directly at Marcus. "Captain Johnson, is everything okay here?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. Marcus nodded respectfully. "Yes, sir, this is a misunderstanding. I've done everything by the book, but Mr. Plot Stevens here," he motioned to Richard, "refuses to let me board my flight without giving any clear reason." David glanced briefly at Richard, who was shifting uncomfortably under the scrutiny. David's eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't speak just yet. Instead, he turned back to Marcus. "Mr. Stevens," David said, his tone cool, "could you explain what's going on here? Why exactly are we denying this pilot access to his flight?" Richard stammered for a moment. I just thought something was wrong with his paperwork," he said, his voice wavering. "I didn't recognize him, and there were some discrepancies." David raised an eyebrow. "Discrepancies?" He turned to Marcus, who was standing still, his face calm but with a faint hint of disappointment. "Captain Johnson, I need to ask you to clear up something for Mr. Stevens." Marcus took a deep breath before speaking. "I'm not just a regular pilot, Mr. Stevens. I'm part of your airline's senior training team. I've been overseeing new pilot education and certification for the past several years." Richard's face went pale as the words hit him. He hadn't expected this. "Wait, you're part of the training program?" Richard stammered. Marcus nodded, his voice steady. "I'm one of the most senior officers in this company. I was assigned here not just to fly, but to monitor how things are handled on the ground as well." David turned to Richard with a stern expression. "Mr. Stevens, you've just tried to deny one of our highest-ranking officers. I think you owe Captain Johnson an apology." and we will need to have a discussion about your conduct here." Richard's mind raced. His jaw clenched as he realized the magnitude of his mistake. He had just tried to block one of the most respected figures in the company, all because of his own biases. The shock of the revelation hit him hard, and for a moment, he could only stand there, frozen, his face a mixture of disbelief and shame. Marcus stood silently, his composure unshaken. He had known that this was a possibility, that his true identity would eventually come to light, but in this moment, it was clear that Richard was learning a harsh lesson. David turned to Marcus, his voice now softening. "Thank you for your patience, Captain. We will address this immediately." As the situation began to calm, Marcus glanced at Richard. "This is bigger than just this moment. It's about changing how things work around here." The tension in the room was thick. Richard stood there, his face reddening with embarrassment. His earlier confidence had evaporated. The realization of what he had just done weighed heavily on him. But there was no turning back now. He had made a mistake, a big one, and now, everyone in the room knew it. David, the senior manager, turned to the employees who had gathered to watch. "This situation will be addressed, but it is clear that bias has no place in this company. We will be reviewing all protocols to ensure this does not happen again," he said, his voice firm. Marcus, still standing calmly, didn't react to the apology he knew was coming. He simply nodded. "Thank you," he said, "but actions speak louder than words. This needs to change for everyone." Richard, feeling a deep shame, finally spoke. I'm sorry, Captain Johnson. I shouldn't have treated you like that." His voice was small now, lacking the arrogance it had earlier. Marcus gave a small nod, his voice still steady. "I appreciate the apology, but the truth is, this is bigger than one apology. You need to understand why this is wrong and what it costs, not just to me, but to the company as a whole." David turned to Richard, his expression hardening. "We will be discussing further actions regarding your behavior. For now, Captain Johnson, your flight is ready to depart. Please proceed." As Marcus walked towards the plane, the weight of the moment seemed to lift. He wasn't just a pilot, he was a symbol of something larger, something worth fighting for. And although Richard's actions had caused pain, they had also brought a hidden issue into the light. Things would be different from now on. Richard watched as Marcus walked away, heading toward the plane. The earlier tension in the air was starting to dissolve, but the weight of what had just happened still lingered. Richard stood there, a deep sense of regret creeping over him. He had been so sure of his decision, so confident that he was in the right, but now he realized just how wrong he had been. The lesson wasn't just about the pilot or even about his own actions. It was about something much deeper, the prejudice that had shaped his thinking without him even realizing it. Richard had acted out of fear, out of a bias he had carried for too long. And now it was clear that he couldn't ignore it any longer. Marcus's bravery had forced Richard to confront a harsh truth about himself. He wasn't just apologizing for blocking a pilot from his flight, he was apologizing for a deeper, ingrained problem he had been blind to. The reality was, his behavior could have cost the airline its reputation and harmed the careers of countless qualified individuals. As Richard stood in the terminal, he couldn't shake the realization that his actions had consequences far beyond this one interaction. It wasn't just about one person being denied their job. It was about the systemic issues that still existed, and how, if left unchecked, they could continue to harm everyone. But Marcus's quiet strength, his unwavering professionalism, had set the wheels in motion for change. Richard knew that things couldn't go back to the way they were. He would have to do better. The time for change had come, not just for the airline, but for himself. And that was a truth Richard would carry with him from this day forward.